going to talk a little bit about the top 10 things that we're seeing for people who are trying to play in the kids space. So I'm the CEO of Play Collective and Play Science. We are insight, strategy, product design, specifically focused on kids and families, and focused on play across platforms. So this is all sort of our experience over the past 2, 3, 4 years and sort of the trends that we're seeing right now in the kids and family space. So how do we go about getting ahead in this race in the kids and family market? So what I'm going to do today is go through the top 10 sort of play big ideas that have come out for us this year. It's actually 11. I can't count very well, so we'll just let that go. But the first one is to develop for flexibility and adaptability. So whether this is talking about being much more iterative in design or developing as much as possible, relatively platform agnostic, this is something where we've seen real issues with partners of ours who have not done that in ending up in the kids space in particular at being at a real disadvantage. So if we look at just taking the past 3 years, what have we seen as the big changes in play, right? 2010, we have the iPad 1 being released. 2013, we now have tablets or e-readers in over 50% of US households that have children. Families with kids over-index on every technology adoption, right? And this is, so we're talking about massive, massive increase, and we're seeing an increase of about 25% every year. So you can sort of see what that's going to look like in the next couple of years. 2010, it was all about the iPod Touch for kids, right? That was the cool thing that they were getting. They weren't getting iPhones, but they were getting the iPod Touch. So we were seeing that being hot. Now it's definitely tablets for mobile play. Again, whether that is we're talking about iPad or Android, we're talking about Kindle Fires, which have had a huge success in the family space, or we're talking about the newest LeapPad, right, which has also seen a lot of success. You know, we've got hot virtual worlds back then. It was Pop Tropica, it was Build-A-Bear, Club Penguin, Free Roams. Now, these, you know, some of these are still there and doing really well, but now we've got Moshi Monsters and Minecraft and Roblox and still Club Penguin, right? We've gone from Super Mario Galaxy to Skylanders, right? And kids being obsessed with the sort of transcription of these physical products into the virtual space. And I think from a more general perspective, we've seen play changing from, in 2010, again, 3 years ago, it being about collecting, customization, and mini games, right? That's what people talked about when they talked about casual gaming. Now we see, and this is again coming from your consumer, we see it's about creativity. It's about collecting with a purpose, right? So not just randomly collecting something, but collecting something that's going to give me something within the game itself, and replayability. And those are the really critical things for what it takes to be successful in the kids side of the app market. Really quick mobile tech timeline. Again, you guys are in this space, you know this, but I think when you kind of see it visually, it really brings to bear how important it is to be flexible and adaptive. You know, in 2009, Android smartphones were 3% globally, or that's what you had with smartphones going out. It's now 64% globally, right? So again, if you're talking about being outside of the US as well, you're seeing massive changes in platform. Now, you know, yes, we still are seeing higher margins and higher revenue on iOS, but we're also seeing adoption by schools now of Android, right? So we're starting to see some major shifts when we start talking about platforms, right? And again, you're talking about within about a year going from about a quarter of US households with kids having a tablet or e-reader to over half, right? 25% increases in who has tablets. And even more importantly, when you're developing for kids, and you know, we hear a lot of people who say, oh, this product is for 6 to 12s. 6 to 12s is 2 to 3 tech generations now, right? So this is data from a study we did actually in partnership with Casual Connect. It looks at casual gaming for families in China, the US, and Mexico, and Germany, China, US, Mexico, and Germany. And what we see is there's actually a vast difference if you look at 2 to 5-year-olds versus 6 to 9 versus 10 to 13 on what platforms they go or they prefer to game on, right? So if you're talking about building something and you're saying, you know, I'm reaching 6 to 13s, well, that could actually be a really big difference and shift in the platforms that they prioritize to play games on, right? So all those things mean that we need flexibility and adaptability. We also need to continue to consider multi-screen experiences. I'm not necessarily talking about transmedia and stuff like that. That's actually a whole other conversation. I'm talking about literally how do we have experiences that cross screens. There's still a huge amount of potential in second screen. I don't think we've gotten it in the adult space either. But in the kid space, we have some different issues, right? Kids, for example, cannot co-locate very well. If you're talking about trying to do something on a tablet and then also having it on a TV screen at the same time, cognitively they have issues with co-location. So it may not be about a co-located experience, which is what most people sort of immediately think of when they think of second screen. But what we are seeing is that, A, families with kids right now have 10 devices on average in their home, right? This is for families with kids 6+, 10 devices. So we're not even just talking about having opportunities for second screen, we're talking about third screen, fourth screen, fifth screen. And we're also seeing that 84% of parents are interested in the idea of asynchronous cooperative games with kids. So when we start thinking about multi-screen, thinking about things like, well, what if it's not about immediately playing right then? What if it's about the kid does something on the tablet that they have, the parent then does something later on their smartphone, right? This is something, and it's all playing together, right? It could also be competitive, but parents are really interested in this idea of how can we use these 10 devices that are in our house to actually be playing together in a way that's not the pass back, pass over, right? That we have our devices, how do we use those to play together? So that's an opportunity for us. We also need to understand what value means for kids and parents now and how that's changing. And again, seeing significant changes in how parents talk about value for them in just 2 or 3 years, right? So the golden rules, the things that don't change for parents, make my life easier, make my kids happy, right? Those are the number 1 and number 2 things for parents. The third one is make them sort of safe and smarter, right? So that's certainly important, but make my life easier, make my kids happy in your marketing messages and how you're developing. If you keep these 2 things in mind, honestly, you'd be amazed at the massive hurdles that you can overcome from a parent perspective. That's value for them. But also, we're seeing a huge increase in how education is bringing value to the market, and we're actually seeing it translate into dollars, right? So it's not that everything has to be educational, but, and my next point will be about not running away from education. So we're seeing that 60% of parents feel guilty just sort of handing over a tablet, right? If I hand over my tablet or a smartphone, you know, that's compared to like 15% if they hand over a book to their child, right? But when they have educational apps, so parents who have 10 plus educational apps, basically they've gone and said, okay, but I'm going to download some educational stuff for my kids. Significantly fewer, only 42% of those have any guilt when they hand over that iPad, right? So just even having educational content on devices is important. So that's important if you're a developer. It's also important if you're an OEM and you're going out with a new handset on the market, right? I mean, the idea of actually sort of preloading content, or if you're somebody who's developing this stuff, getting in partnerships with OEMs where you're sort of preloading content, that's actually a big win for parents in the family space. And ebooks right now, we're seeing more value than the app category. So this is actually literally fresh data that just came out. The report is coming out in a couple of weeks. It's a project we do at Digital Book World. But parents say they pay an average of $1.75 more per ebook than what they're willing to pay for apps, right? If they're going to pay for apps. And if we look at older versus younger kids, they're also willing to pay about $3 more for ebooks for those older kids, for 10 to 13-year-olds. That's actually a huge marketplace right now that is not being tapped, is the ebooks for the older kids, right? Whether it's chapter books or anything else, there's something there where parents are recognizing. We also have a massive issue with the 4th grade reading slump, right? Where kids are sort of between 3rd and 4th grade, losing a lot of literacy skills that they have. So there's a huge opportunity even in older kids for educational content, and we haven't really tapped that. But even within this, the educational definitions are changing. So a couple of years ago, it was all about sort of the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s, right? Traditional educationally defined topics would be the things that parents are really interested in. Now what we're seeing is it's about 21st century skills. It's about creativity. It's about problem solving. That the things that parents are saying they're willing to pay for, right? They're sort of like, look, there's a glut and all this other stuff. But wow, you show me something. For example, we were just looking at something like a Roblox or a Minecraft, where a kid is creating, or even if you're somebody who's creating an app for kids, if you're talking about marketing and messaging to parents, allowing kids to share with their parents what they create, and then messaging at the bottom of that email to them about all the other stuff that they can buy, that's actually a great marketing message, right? They don't want random messages for you, but you send them what their kid created, suddenly you've actually created a really great relationship with them, and they're seeing educational value in that for their child. So another thing is, not to run away from education. Education's not a bad thing. So little audience pop quiz, keep you guys awake. Anyone know what the #3 family and youth website for 6 to 14s over the past 12 months was? This is, of course, according to ComScore UVs. Anyone? Damn, you're good. All right? I really seriously didn't put him there. I don't even know who he is. But that's true. So this is what it looks like, right? So we're not talking about the most stylish, site. Coolmathgames.com, daily time spent is 58 minutes, right? And most of that time spent is in school, right? Which is, again, sort of a marketplace that we don't necessarily always think about. Advertising revenue model for that, right? Doing pretty well. The fifth thing is we need to make sure that we're giving the child agency in the experience. And again, this is a pretty big shift generationally. Not many tech generationally, but generationally for this generation of kids. They expect to have agency. They expect to have a say or a role in what it is that they're doing. So, first of all, kids make their own. I don't care what you're doing, they're going to make something up around what you've developed, right? If you've created Angry Birds, they're going to make up a metagame where they're actually competing against their friends, right? So that's actually, they sort of create play around whatever it is that you've done. And there's a great quote from Lane Merrifield that he had at the In-Play conference this past year, or a couple months ago in Canada, where he said, make it theirs, not yours, right? That was a big thing for Club Penguin, and the success for Club Penguin was they sort of said, look, we're going to listen to people. We're going to make it theirs. We're not just going to make it about us. One of my favorite examples from Habbo is where, for a Habbo hotel, and this is actually a relatively old example, but it's just one that I think is great, where kids were starting to take blue blocks, and they were creating swimming pools, right? By just using blocks or chairs or whatever they found. They sort of were creating objects, which actually made Habbo be interested in creating that, right? So they were using what kids were doing instinctively to start developing content, and that's something that's a really interesting thing to keep in mind. So empowering them to play, giving them the tools to make it their own, which is actually following very much what David was saying about Roblox, that is something we're seeing is important. We're also seeing a huge movement for kids as makers, right? Sort of the maker movement for kids. And we're seeing a lot of either cross-platform products or really physical products, things like Little Bits, which are engineering kits for kids, the 3D Doodler, which I have gotten off Kickstarter, and my team is so excited to get one in the office, which actually allows you to create 3D shapes by using sort of a pen, right? A little bit like a glue gun on crack. I don't know if that's probably how they would use the marketing materials, but so maybe not. Yumigo, which is one of the Ready to Learn funded grants from the Department of Education, which is sort of a transmedia property about kids making stuff, but with math, right? So it's a maker math context. So there's a lot of stuff about kids wanting to make more, and how do we transcribe that online, and how do we make that also something that we have across platforms, right? That we create this sort of physical and digital mix. Another thing that we talk a lot about is this: what is the right mix between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation when it comes to developing for kids? So one of the biggest things is that gamification is not a panacea, right? This is not going to solve everybody's problem, whether it's you're developing educational games, you're just creating stuff for kids, that there is this mix, and it's a really fascinating mix of extrinsic and intrinsic motivation that works really well when it comes to developing stuff for kids, right? So gamification, the things like badges and things, those can help in short term, but they don't ever help in long-term engagement and solutions, right? For kids, it's that unstructured, well, not unstructured play, but the ability to play and be intrinsically motivated that's going to keep them with something. But that said, the sort of gaming elements do have a really interesting place within this, but keeping in mind what that place is important. So first of all, this is a generation who's grown up with leveling up, right? Like literally they talk about leveling up. It's sort of a commonplace thing for them. So the idea of meeting new challenges as you go along is really important. The other side of that is they're also a generation that expects personalization within leveling up, right? This is not just about leveling up for everybody. This is kind of about what does it mean to level up for me, right? Because it's of course about me. And then games are really great at visually showing progress and giving instant feedback, right? So that idea of sort of have a progress loop is really good for educational games. The idea of creating what we call learning positioning systems which is the idea of basically creating a way so as you're going along, you can see how you're doing in a game, is actually really important for kids. It gives them a way to sort of track their progress, and that's a positive thing. And then again, if you're doing educational games, games are actually a really great way to informally assess without testing, right? So you can use games and the way kids progress in games to be getting feedback on how well they're doing or how well they're learning or how well they're progressing without necessarily having to give them the pop quiz at the end of the game, right? Which takes it completely away from having an actual game experience for them. Another issue is to consider social emotional learning, right? We talk a lot about, there's a lot of different, in the casual game space, there's a lot of different positive impacts that people have focused their casual games on. Social emotional is one that there has not been a lot of emphasis on. And it's interesting because if you look at the kids' media space, if you look at TV programming, social emotional is actually one of the most popular things to cover, right? In part because there's narrative and there's longer stories, but we're not really seeing that in the casual gaming space, in the gaming space in general, and it's a critical developmental skill for kids. What's also interesting is the way that kids play casual games, if you sort of ethnographically watch kids playing, there's so much going on that's social emotional that we could be tapping into again, right? They're competing against each other, they want to play together. What are ways that we can either create frameworks or we can actually put social emotional learning into games? And the other thing is that we sometimes hear people say, right, but we're dealing with sort of social stuff because we have chat, right? And kids can chat in the world. But the reality is, unless you're giving kids feedback, right, about what they're doing in chat or how they're communicating with people, that's not really learning, right? It's giving them an opportunity to talk, but it's not necessarily helping them to improve their social emotional skills or communication. The 8th thing is not to ignore key secondary audiences and markets. This is a big one. I feel like I've probably said this for several years in a row, but it just keeps getting more and more important. Dads are more willing to spend money in this space, period, right? They also have much more of a say in family household purchasing decisions when it comes to technology and when it comes to gaming. So it's a very different model than what you traditionally hear from advertising firms and stuff about, well, you don't want to talk to dads because they don't make any purchase decisions. Well, they do in this space. They're willing to spend 50% more per smartphone app and 75% more than tablet apps for the moms, right? They see more value in gaming, so they're more likely to be doing that. And they are particularly interested, again, if you're thinking about sort of the educational side, in apps that teach science, history, and foreign languages, right? So if you're in those spaces, those are places where dads are actually really interested in those kinds of educational. So think about marketing to them. And then our other totally untapped resource is grandparents. They are becoming significantly more important inside family households for the day-to-day sort of what's going on with families. On the left here, I have sort of from the Census Bureau, no, actually this is from the MetLife, but this is looking at 3-generation households in the US and the increase. So the aqua bar at the top is 3-generation households in the US, right, in the millions, versus 2020 versus the green one, which is 2010. So you see a significant increase in these sort of younger, more tech-savvy 3-generation households where grandparents are actually in the home, right? In addition, whether they're in the home or not, we have grandparents. First of all, 3 in every 10 adults, period, is a grandparent. Like, that's a huge amount of grandparents. They control the majority of financial assets today, and they spend them on their grandchildren. Like, seriously spend them on their grandchildren, right? It's larger than either the African American or Hispanic population. So as you start talking about targeting, this is a population that's really important. And these are not, a lot of times when people think of grandparents, they're like, oh, they must not be really tech savvy and they're older. The median age of becoming a grandparent is 50 for a woman and 54 for a man in the US right now, right? We're talking about people who are really young. 9, and this is, of course, something that we talk a lot about in this space, having sort of imagination and adaptability when it comes to business models and monetization. I don't think we've figured it out in the kids and family space. There are issues with sort of every model that we've kind of had out there, whether it's subscription or freemium. That said, I think that if we look at the space and certainly most recent data, we're seeing it's not really getting any easier. Right now, 90% of iOS apps are free to download. That's up 6% from a year ago, and another 6% costs 99 cents. This is the most recent data that just came out from Flurry. So we definitely are in a tough market space. That said, parents actually do still very much, this is for not just the kids market, this is overall, but we do hear parents talk about the fact that if this is something my kid really wants, I have absolutely no issue with paying for it, right? But I have to see that value up front, which was sort of a little bit of the conversation earlier. And we need to explore other models or even reimagine or review the models that we already have. So there's been a lot of really negative stuff about freemium, about kids and upsell and all this kind of stuff. There's nothing inherently wrong with freemium in the kids space. It's a question of how do we ethically and in good faith work with kids to have a freemium model, right? They need to learn this stuff anyway. In the same way that we've seen, if we talk about subscription, sort of the mix between subscription and microtransactions, the model that parents really like is more of an allowance model, right? The idea that it's kind of a subscription, but it feels like microtransactions for the kids. The parents see it as a huge value because their child is learning in the same way you do with an allowance. The kids see it as value because they own ownership and have agency over how the money is spent, right? So reframing and rethinking some of these models, I think, is really important. And we are seeing the rise of the app brand, whether it's a Toca Boca or whatever, as becoming more important, and I think probably more important in the kids space than in other spaces. I'm running out of time, but there are a couple of just important things I want to make sure we cover. One is just that physical still holds a lot of value. I know you guys can't see this, but the bottom line here is that basically when you add digital to physical, there is significant increase across all categories in the value of both, right? So it's like you put physical and digital together and the value increases significantly. And in fact, we're seeing a difference where 21% of every entertainment dollar for kids right now is digital, and that's up from 15 cents to the dollar a couple of years ago. So we are seeing a significant increase in value for there. I'm not going to get into Box of Awesome. If you don't know about it, check it out. It's really, really cool, and they have both a physical and a digital component to it. But it's a really interesting new model of how do we bring content to kids. And the last thing, well, the almost last thing, is the idea of keeping in mind doing good and doing well. This is a generation of kids they want to be empowered to help. They love the idea of helping. They are optimistic. They're solution-oriented. What they usually just need is the agency or giving them the tools to do something. 2/3 feel that they're more motivated than other generations. They over-index on every issue, social, environmental, you name it, they over-index on it. They consider themselves activists, but they don't necessarily, even though there's tons of stuff they can do online, they don't necessarily feel like they have that efficacy for change. And I'm happy to talk to any of you guys if you want to after this. But really, what ends up happening is there's this sort of stages of making a difference, and we have some really interesting models like Coins for Change from Club Penguin who have tried to sort of tap into this, but they don't really consider this whole model, right? So Coins for Change is a great example of, this is in the fall, and kids can play on Club Penguin, and they can donate their coins to one of 3 different causes. The problem is there's not enough in Club Penguin to help them understand and sort of know and care about it to really activate them into being more committed or owning the topic, right? Whatever it is that they want. So I think we have a lot of really interesting opportunities to do a better job of activating this generation of kids into more social change. And the last one, again, this seems obvious, but make sure you put the child's experience first. We've watched more small companies, startups, people running after VC money, just kind of forget that and move toward, look for the money as opposed to really keeping that kid's experience in mind. And in every case, they have failed. If you can keep the kid's experience in mind and put it first, you will succeed, right? Because you're going to have a great product. But doing the research, making sure you're testing it with kids, not your own children, please, because they're not normal. I will guarantee you that if you have them, right? But doing that is really important as well. Questions? Or did I just overwhelm you with insane amounts of information? I'm sorry. She's going to bring you a microphone.
Hi. Maybe I'm a little off on this, but why is it you suppose that physical activity games that are educational for console for kids just isn't really there much?
Are you talking about the...
Like you can bowl, You can play tennis. There are physical activity games.
Right.
And there are educational games. And the physical ones are on the console, and the educational ones are on the couch with a tablet in your lap. And at what point, or is there a market for it to flip over?
Yeah. No, I mean, I definitely think, I think there's definitely a market for it. I mean, we've worked with some companies who've tried to also bridge more the gaming into the real world with the object, right? Which we're seeing some of that in the physical, like, I mean, there's a great opportunity even in creating gaming around things like the Fitbit or any of those Nike Plus.
Parents want their kids outside playing or learning, and it's like a choice.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and we also see that when they're, even if it's not called educational, things like Dance Dance Revolution, right, which is actually being used in schools, what we end up seeing is parents and kids fighting over the console because mom wants to play it too, right? So I think there's an opportunity not just for kids, but for more family-oriented activity that has a positive impact, whether you call it educational or not, it has a positive impact. I think there's absolutely an opportunity. Parents want it.
Thanks. Can you just address briefly the issues of COPA and privacy now in terms of collecting data and how parents feel about that?
Yeah, that is a really, really good one. And I think that Joe is going to be talking, from Virtual Piggy, is going to be talking a little bit more about that. You know, we are seeing changes, big changes recently have come out for COPA regulations. Here's the thing, parents definitely want their kids to feel safe, right? Are they as concerned as all the COPA regulations that they're getting? No, probably not, right? Most parents are kind of like, look, I get advertising, right? If you're going to give it to me free, it's okay. They still want their kids to be safe. I mean, the reality is you're going to have to abide by them, but if you're really looking at going overboard, and I think this is what some people have done, is they've sort of said, we need to go way beyond COPPA compliance, what you're probably going to find is parents that's not going to necessarily give you your added value, right? Unless that is for some reason your real value proposition, right? But if you're doing that, you're reaching a very, very small subset of parents who have a very different parenting style, right? That tends to be much more of sort of a hover parenting than your average parent who's just like, look, make it easy for me, make my kids happy, and it's safe in some way, then I'm totally fine. All right, thank you guys.